Good morning and welcome to the final part of our lecture on ethics. In this part, we will highlight some case studies that involve ethical conflicts throughout the history of science that arose, and we'll discuss them in terms of what went wrong from an ethical perspective. We'll start off with hypothetical cases. Let's say that Mike, a postdoctoral researcher who studies the effect of drugs on Alzheimer's disease at Harvard University, is currently testing a drug at different dosages on 100 laboratory mice. Well, one could obviously reason that what he does is very important in terms of society, and he needs the 100 mice, obviously, to claim statistical relevance. Now, let's say that in his experiments he needs to perform both cognitive and behavioral tests on each mouse and then introduces the drugs. He has spent 1 month performing these experiments, gathering data on 90 mice. He's almost done with his whole experiment and only has to test 10 more mice. However, winter break starts in a week, and he has promised his parents that he will be home for Christmas. He really wants to finish his work in time to be home for the holiday season, and since he already done the work on 90 mice, and he injected the drug in all 100 mice, the only thing he needs to do is finish collecting data from the cognitive and behavioral tests before he can go home. Then he can analyze the data afterwards. However, taking these 10 mice and doing these tests will take some time, and finishing the data collection will break his promise to his parents because it will take, let's say, 2-3 weeks. After juggling his dilemmas, he decides to extrapolate the data he already has on the 90 mice and produce the 10 additional results. Now, do you think Mike has committed scientific misconduct? Well, the answer is obviously yes, because you can't fabricate data, and what you should have done is taken the data of those 90 mice and use it as is. And if it's not statistically relevant, then probably he had to just sit it out and do the extra experiments because probably he couldn't start up the experiments in January after the winter break. So he would have to break his promise to his parents. And you can see that it is very tricky to do so because on paper you can say that, but obviously morally you also have a moral obligation towards your parents, probably. Maybe he studies at Harvard but lives a couple of 100 kilometers away. And this would mean he wouldn't see his parents for half a year, not only with Christmas. So, this is an example of how some moral flexibility, some moral juggling, and giving priority to your social life over science, which is in a way somewhat understandable, can still lead to scientific misconduct and should never take place, of course. But it happens, and that is, of course, what you need to be aware of. Despite the fact that we are scientists and we claim to be always very skeptical, open-minded, and critical, we aren't always because we're also humans with social connections. So it's a very obvious case of scientific misconduct, but it's somewhat understandable because we're all humans. Now, let's take a second hypothetical case. Let's say that a world-leading scientist, Dr. X, discovers an error in his data, but the data are already published in a paper for publication in a high-ranking journal. And he starts to look into the error and he's starting to like estimate what the impact will be on the overall conclusions, and he comes to the conclusion that like the conclusions drawn from the manuscript would be exactly the same, but the finding, the error, without the error, the data can be potentially misleading. Since the article has already gone to press and it's too late to report the error before it appears in print, he would have to signal this to the editor, who would of course be very furious, and they would have to make an addendum and a corrigendum to show that the article was actually contained an error. To avoid embarrassment, because that would happen of course, Dr. X decides to ignore the error. Now, do you think Dr. X is doing the right thing? And obviously the answer is again no. Of course not. So he isn't doing the right thing, of course. Again, these things do happen in science, and it's understandable because, like, you took the effort to publish an article and you feel that, okay, there's a small error I didn't know about before, and if I wouldn't have discovered, the paper would have been published as is, and the data would be exactly the same in a way. The conclusion would be exactly the same, and people try to build on my work would end up with the same data anyway. The only thing is that there's a small error in there and it's kind of misleading. Now, be that as it may, obviously, again, be it may be understandable in a way, it is, of course, not the right thing. Now, these are just hypothetical issues, but we'll look into some actual examples that actually happen in science throughout history to show that these things also do happen in real life. So, a very well-known example of this is Jan Hendrik Schön. Jan Hendrik Schön was somebody working at Bell Labs in Germany, and at a certain point in time, he had a research line that was very successful, leading to articles being published in Science and Nature. But soon, what seemed too good to be true actually was too good to be true, and suspicion started arising when his lab mates and people working at other laboratories all over Germany and the rest of the world were not able to replicate his data while they did exactly the same experiments. On a number of occasions, he came to conclusions that other researchers couldn't solve, and sometimes when researchers flag these errors, they offer to cite them in the next article or even include them in the next article as a co-author to try to cover up what he actually did. He also wasn't really able to prove he was innocent because he didn't keep any lab books up to date. Most measurements were not stored uh, in hard copies, but only in digital forms and had been deleted. Some of the equipment he used was no longer available, and he always did his measurements alone and processed the data alone. So nobody had actually witnessed what he did. So suspicion became bigger and bigger. And later, Schoen actually admitted that he made mistakes in his graph, but he said the results were actually based on real experiments. And although I made an error here and there, what I showed was actually true. At the end of the investigation, he even had to deny that that was actually the case, and he confessed to inventing and falsifying his data. Now, this goes to show that although you don't do you're not adhering to ethical guidelines and therefore are technically not a good scientist, you can still be successful in a way before the deception comes out, at least, because Schoen was considered to be a very, very successful scientist, and he was even considered as the director of one of the biggest Max Planck institutes in Germany. Obviously, when the investigation was finished, he was dismissed with immediate effect, and even his doctoral degree was revoked by his university due to dishonorable conduct, not even due to his results during his doctorate being false, but actually because of his behavior afterwards, reflecting bad on the university. So here the question is not actually did Jan Hendrik Schoen did something wrong, because he was obviously punished, and we obviously all agree that he did something wrong. But should his superiors, especially his boss, but also the co-authors on the articles, also share the responsibility and consequence as well? That becomes more difficult because a superior that should maybe identify what is going on at a certain point in time. He should be more specific. Should be more suspicious when he appears to have a goose with golden eggs. That often is too good to be true, and maybe he should have been more skeptical. But then again, maybe he did check into the data. Maybe the data were fabricated in such a way that you can't really know for sure that they were fabricated, and maybe Uh, he did uh, start the investigation in time, and nothing is really he's not really responsible them for them. The co-authors, obviously the ones that were offered co-authorship after they had some critique on the work, should be held responsible, but probably there's also other co-workers or co-authors that just basically did, I'm just saying, like some elemental analysis, and they did that for him, and they checked that part of the article, and that was cool, and the rest of the article they had to believe him. So it's often very difficult to punish co-authors and superiors, although in theory they have responsibility over a researcher, and they have some responsibility about the work that's published with their name on it. It's not often easy to link them to the actual scientific fraud. Now, both the hypothetical examples we had and the example up until now were mainly part of scientific conduct, right? More about being honest, being objective, and not claiming scientific fraud. Ethics often doesn't even imply that. These are really blatant cases. Often it's more about, does the end justify the means? Am I using lab animals while I shouldn't? And a very good example of do the end justify the means is what we call, oh, I made an error, the CRISPR baby scandal, where 2 years ago, a Chinese professor called He Yang-yu, an associate professor at the Southern University of Science and Technology in Shenzhen, China, was working in a program where he was doing fertility studies on embryos from HIV positive fathers and HIV negative mothers. And he got consent from the hospital to not only study these embryos, but also to, or he thought he had consent, or he said he had consent to also gene edit these embryos using CRISPR-Cas9 to create HIV immunity in the babies. And he wanted to actually, he didn't feel that he did much wrong because he felt like, okay, technically there is not really an ethical framework for what I'm doing here, although morally it might be wrong. I think the benefits outweigh the harm I potentially could have done to these embryos, largely because this can be a change, like a revolutionary change in the way we do medicine and the way we do gene editing in humans. And he wanted to make his results public at a conference in Hong Kong. But a few days before the conference, MIT Technology Research exposed his research and a large scandal evolved. Scientists and governmental bodies were obviously outraged as he did not follow ethical procedures. He claimed to have ethical clearance, but it was very doubtful that he actually had specific clearance to actually gene edit these babies. And the technology at that point, every scientist agreed on that the technology of gene editing at that point was too premature to perform on humans. So he did it in mice and in apes, and then without actually having proper permission, just transported these results and used them to do the same experiments in humans. And because side effects were not clearly studied and there was no medical reason to perform the procedure, the babies were healthy. It was just about, can I do it? Obviously, if you look at the ethical framework in general of biomedical research, it was considered to be highly unethical, although the framework for gene editing wasn't really there. Now, what it did was it led China and other countries to vote in laws where gene editing was prohibited, and the results of gene editing, let's say the babies were healthy now, but let's say the babies would have died, that would mean that you would be accountable in the future for when something like that happens, and you would be charged for murder. Eventually, Dr. Jiang Ku was arrested and was put in jail for 3 years, and also World Health Organization temporarily halted all research on gene editing. And that's what we said before, right? We said that if you actually do unethical research, that might often lead to funds being halted, research actually slowing down rather than it progressing. And although ethics seemingly has a hold on the progression of science, the progression of knowledge in in a society, what actually happens is that ethics makes sure that it moves in the right direction rather than in the wrong direction. And doing unethical research often results in a decrease in the progression of knowledge rather than a faster increase. You can watch the video on YouTube to get some more information about it, but this is the story in a nutshell. Now, very important in what we saw in the previous research is that you have to ask yourself if something is really um, morally okay to do. Like, what are the effects on the people I work with? What are the possible side effects? Is it morally okay? Is it urgent enough to test the procedure? Is the procedure advanced enough? How do the end outweigh? How does the end outweighs the means to get to a certain point? And a very important concept in ethics in terms of biomedical research is informed consent. Now, informed consent, according to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, is a voluntary agreement with an action proposed by another. Now, consent is an act of reason, and very important in the definition of consent is that the person giving consent must be of sufficient mental capacity and possession of all essential information in order to give valid consent. For instance, when a person is an infant mentally incompetent or under the influence of drugs is incapable of giving consent. Consent must also be free of coercion or fraud. Now, this is very important because this definition wasn't always there. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment is an ethical scandal that shows that informed consent wasn't always what it is today. You can look at the video on YouTube, and basically what the idea was that they tested in the early 30s, 1930s, they tested uh, a group of Afro-American men, some of them having syphilis and the other one being the control group, and they tested them to see what would happen when they didn't treat the syphilis. At that point in time, they had some treatments for syphilis that weren't really effective, and they would like to know, like, what if we don't treat it? Isn't it actually better than treating it? So they tried that. The company Tuskegee, along with the Public Health Service in America, set up this experiment, and they didn't really get did they didn't really do anything wrong at the time, because at the time there was no ethical framework to build upon. But obviously they tested these people for 40 years. Some of them were really sick. Some of them afterwards died. Obviously, in an ethical framework that happened after World War II, after the Nazi experiments, that would be considered to be unethical. And the study went on from 1932 to the early 70s, so almost 40 years. Uh, in that respect, a couple of years before the experiment started, they discovered penicillin, and penicillin already in the 1930s was used as a drug to prevent infection. And from 1945, so after like 10 to 15 years in the study, it was officially approved as the way to treat syphilis. And despite the fact that they had it, they didn't offer it to these people that were suffering from the disease. And this is, of course, something that can never happen. And the problem there was, if you look at it today, this scandal actually triggered the formation of laws involving informed consent in a way, because what became very important before was that you needed consent from the government. You needed the government to say it's okay to do it like this. Right nowadays, you need informed consent from the actual people doing it, and in this case, they didn't. Right? They didn't. They misinformed these people, and they also bribed these people, offering them free medical service and funeral insurance, which for poor people at the time was obviously very tempting to perform, to participate in experiments. So nowadays, this would be considered highly unethical, and in hindsight, it was regarded highly unethical because after World War II, the Nuremberg Code was taken was was accepted, and therefore they did break the law and they did have to pay the people back. But it shows that ethical frameworks during over time will change, and often it takes stuff like the Nazi experiments or stuff like this syphilis experiment to actually change the laws for the better. Now, the story of HeLa cells is a bit similar, but here it's much more difficult to judge whether or not the end doesn't justify the means, because HeLa cells, like you can see in the YouTube movie, are actually very important for the progression of science and have been very important for the progression of science during the past few decades. So the ends are definitely very important. We can all agree to that. And in a way, the patient wasn't harmed before, right? Because the patient died from a tumor, and the tumor cells were just merely kept as a sample. And at that time, that was perfectly okay to do so. So they didn't break any ethical laws or anything at that point in time. And they kept the cells actually, and then did experiments on them. So you could reason that the adverse health effects on the patient giving the cells was not actually there. But if you look at it from a current point of view, from the current point of view on privacy and on informed consent, obviously this would be regarded as unethical today, because even though a person might have reasons that you find to be ridiculous not to give these cells to science, it is her or his God-given right. Of course, it's their constitutional right to do so. So they can you can even reason that in terms of privacy, because they actually call them HeLa cells as a tribute. But this also raises some privacy questions, obviously, because they call them HeLa cells as a tribute, but without actually notifying the person or the family. So now everybody knows that this immortalized cell lines actually belong to Henrietta Lacks. And afterwards, HeLa cells, the genome of HeLa cells was actually sequenced, so they know part of the genome that actually was part of the genome of Henrietta Lacks, and so are also her family. So in terms of privacy, this also raises some more ethical questions. But in contrast to the previous experiment, obviously, the line is more thin, is more blurry. And this is something that makes ethical guidelines and formation of ethical frameworks and guidelines so complex. Now, the main conclusion for you guys in this case is how can I avoid unethical behavior, especially as a student. I don't really always know what is unethical and what is ethical. So when you're in doubt, just ask somebody, ask your supervisor, like we said before, but also you can ask somebody else, either somebody officially involved in research, proper research conduct or ethics, or just like another colleague or another lecturer if you don't trust your supervisor or you don't immediately want to go to the ethics committee. So if you witness unethical behavior and you're sure, act. Use resources provided within the institution to act. Can be the board of examiners or the research ethics committee, and use the professional communities to help you act, and then ask questions to them. Learn from your colleagues and others, and try to always do the right thing. Now, next week, we will have a lecture by Wolfgang. I already contacted Wolfgang, and he will probably not find the time this week to record a lecture, so he'll provide you with a lecture on argumentation, which is very, very important for the written debate arguments assignment. And he will, in that lecture, will explain you how to structure your arguments, how to prepare them, how to deliver them, and how to make a coherent story out of them. So although we won't record the lecture, we will give you the slides and we will refer to we will make a reader based on a book on argumentation, and we will highlight some of the chapters you will need to read. And by combining the lecture with the chapters in the book, you will be able to use that knowledge and implement it into your argumentation assignment. Also, remember to bring copies of your essays. This is not this is not up to date anymore. Remember to send your essays on Wednesday evening or at least Thursday morning to your peers. Thank you for your attention, and I'll see you in the tutorials in the afternoon. Goodbye.